Always a pleasure to be here. I've been in this area on several occasions, and I think the crowds get larger each time I come, which is testimony to the ticket selling ability, not the speaker. I happened to be in the Boston area last night where we had 6 more inches of snow, and somebody was saying over there that there are now 4 seasons, and they are known as early winter, winter, late winter, and next winter. And I wonder if it's ever going to end this year. They set records for the amount of snowfall in that area, and of course the records were broken, but the record was only 2 years old. And I think it has something to do with global warming, but I haven't figured that out. And I heard a story recently about a fellow who wasn't feeling too well, so his wife took him to the doctor, and the doctor examined him, and then she called in the wife. The doctor called in the wife and said, I need to talk to your wife, so you wait out here. And so the woman went in there kind of a little apprehensive, and the doctor said, well, he said, your husband's got these problems, and here's what you have to do. You have to get up every morning and cook him a real hot breakfast. And then at lunchtime, you have to make sure that he gets a good square meal. And then for dinner, none of this TV dinner stuff or anything. You got to fix him a nice roast of some kind and make sure he gets, because if you don't do all of that, he's going to die. And she kind of shook her head, and he said, and he's not going to be able to do any more housework. He couldn't possibly do any housework because, you see, if he does, he's going to die. And then yard work, no, he can't shovel snow and he can't rake the lawn or anything like that, because if he does any of that kind of stuff, he's going to die. So she just nodded her head. And she laughed and she went outside, and finally the fella says to his wife, he said, well, what did the doctor say? She said, you're going to die. Well, I hate to change the subject on you here, but to simply say that there's an awful lot of things that have to be done for this United States of America, or it's going to die. And so we have to get into that. Now, we're here tonight to discuss the insiders, and those of you who have seen my little book on the insiders, I don't have to explain it, but there are probably some here who've never seen it. And I just want to say that this is about the architects of the New World Order, and there are 4 chapters. One's about the Carter years, and then the Reagan years, the Bush years, and the Clinton years, and each of the chapters was written while they were in office. And when we started, we just had a pamphlet, and then we came out with a little book. There were 2 of them, and then the 3 of them in another book, and now it's the 4th edition, and depending on what happens in November, maybe we'll have a 5th edition sometime next year. This year, I would begin to think that their candidate, at least on the Republican side, is a fellow named Dole. And Dole does not have a credential like these other fellows. Dole, well, Ronald Reagan didn't either, but Dole is not a member of any of the organizations we're going to be talking about here. We'll talk about the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission and some of these others. But Dole is a fellow who supports the tax increases, and he supports the taking away of private ownership of weapons, and he supports NAFTA, and he supports GATT, and he supports the United Nations, and so on. And during the recent primary season, I think probably some of you caught the fact that there was another candidate on that Republican side who was opposed to the New World Order and the UN and the CFR and Trilateral and NAFTA and GATT and the whole kit and caboodle of it, and a fellow named Buchanan. And the furious attack on Buchanan reminded me of the attack on the Birch Society. You know, that he's a racist and he's an anti-Semite and he's this and he's that and everything else. So what I want to do here tonight now is to go over some things in history and talk a little bit about what we mean by the insiders. The insiders, of course, is a term that Robert Welsh coined for the Birch Society. It's been used by others in different circumstances. But it was way back in the middle 1960s that Robert Welsh, who had been warning about the communist conspiracy, came out and told us that communism is only a tool of a larger conspiracy that is run by people who aren't themselves communists. There's the people who financed the communists, who helped the communists, who dignified the communists, who kept America fearful of the communists in order to build more and more government here at home. And he said, for want of another term, we'll call them the insiders. Some of them may have been communists, but most of them have never been. And those kinds of people are still there. Now, in our country today, we don't have so many communists. We still have some, I'm sure. We have plenty of state-of-mind communists. So what we're talking about now are the people behind the scenes. Now, the flyer that introduced you to the fact that I was coming here to speak, if in fact you saw the flyer, it had 5 portraits at the top. It had Mr. Bush and Mr. Clinton and Mr. Dole and General Powell. And it also had a fellow named Pinocchio. Maybe you saw that. Right? And the question was, what do all of these have in common? And somebody behind the scenes is pulling the strings. Right? Now, there were a lot of people who said, well, Pinocchio kept telling lies and his nose kept growing. Is that what you mean? I said, no, that's not what we mean. But maybe it does apply in some cases here. So what we intend here tonight is to introduce a startling and indeed a frightening reality to anyone who's been good enough to give us an evening of your time. The reality is that freedom for ourselves and independence for our nation are being destroyed. Not by a foreign power, not by any military occupation force, not by chance. America is gripped by a conspiracy of evildoers. They're within our borders. They're well along in creating a tyrannical world government that they plan to control. And these, of course, are the insiders. Now, I'm going to be presenting a lot of facts. In fact, it might come across to some of you that we're giving a little history lesson here tonight. Well, so be it. But the facts that I present are all documentable. If I should present some and you want to challenge me about it, I'll say, okay, here's where I got it. Here's where you can look it up. And most of it is in the books that we offer here on the table as well. So in other words, we're relying on truth. And we're very much aware of the fact that truth can be unsettling. Robert Welch, who founded our society in 1958, was fond of quoting Ralph Waldo Emerson on this subject. Emerson said, God offers to every mind its choice between truth and repose. Take which you please, you can never have both. Truth or repose. Emerson's assertion, of course, is dour and disheartening. Right? I mean, if you're going to get truth, you're going to lose repose. Well, that's only his way of looking at it, and there is some good sense in it, but it's almost enough to make ostriches out of people. So let's therefore quickly balance what Emerson said with a far more uplifting comment given in the Gospel of St. John, where he said, the truth shall make you free. And I prefer that, obviously. Freedom is what we seek. And not an unrestrained freedom, not license. Freedom to do what is right, according to the laws of God firstly, and also the laws of this land. And truth will indeed make us free. Robert Welch also once stated that all that would be needed to have half of the world's problems disappear in a very short period of time would be to have everyone decide to begin telling the truth right now. Would that all would start doing so, beginning today. In a philosophical sense, truth is conformity with reality, conforming the mind to what's there, reality. It is truth that the earth follows a predictable path as it moves in space. It is not truth, but falsehood, to hold that water will run uphill. It is truth to state that the Constitution of the United States presents no authorization for any president to place U.S. troops in a foreign command. And it is falsehood to state, as CFR, Council on Foreign Relations member Walt Rostow did in 1960, that it is, quote, an American interest to see an end to nationhood as it has been historically defined. He actually said that. And shortly after he said that, he was given a post in the State Department. And they had to waive a security clearance on him in order to get him in to the State Department. In 1916, President Woodrow Wilson campaigned for re-election on a slogan, "He kept us out of war," but he and his staff were doing everything they possibly could to get us into World War I. And in 1940, President Franklin Roosevelt stated, and I say again and again and again, your boys will not be sent into any foreign wars. But as we shall see later, he was already committing America to enter World War II and needed only to have an enemy fire the first shot. And so truth took a holiday, didn't it? Getting us into 2 world wars. We live at a time when many individuals will utter the most obvious falsehoods. Mr. Clinton, for instance, could tell us in his State of the Union speech earlier this year, the era of big government is over. That's especially pertinent just prior to April 15th, isn't it? He knows better, and his refusal to have his utterance conform with the reality that government continues to grow more oppressive should make us suspect of everything else he says. Why was there no response to Mr. Clinton's bold falsehood from the so-called guardians of truth, the national news media? I suspect they were too busy gearing up for the attack on Buchanan. Now, there was a poet named Thomas Campbell who offered a cogent assessment of truth when he wrote, "Truth ever lovely since the world began, the foe of tyrants and the friend of man." James Russell Lowell, however, lamented, "Truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne." Now, one can almost know from the words written by these poets the period in history in which they lived. But what about this conspiracy that I mentioned earlier? Is it truth to hold that such an evil plan exists? Does labeling the threat to our nation a conspiracy conform to the reality of today's world? If so, who are its participants? And even more, how can they be stopped? Well, first of all, let's define conspiracy. It has three elements: secrecy, more than one person, and evil. You have to have all three. It's not a conspiracy for you and your relatives to plan a 40th birthday for your spouse. There's no evil here, even though your spouse might prefer to keep the age quiet, right? Nor does the term conspiracy apply if the complete plans of a group taking some action are publicized openly. But if a government tells us that it wants only to take care of us without revealing its plans to destroy freedom and make slaves of us, that's a conspiracy. In 1966, Georgetown University professor named Carroll Quigley, who had trained many of our Foreign Service officers at Georgetown School of Foreign Service, he issued his now famous book, Tragedy and Hope, and he bared details of a plot to rule the world. That man was named by Bill Clinton as his mentor. Clinton did the naming of him during the Democrat Convention of 1992. And Quigley freely discussed the late 19th century plans of Cecil Rhodes and others to rule the world. Quigley called the group a secret society. He called it a secret network. He even referred to its secret records. But he believed it to be wonderful, not evil. So he never used the term conspiracy. But he certainly should have. Did this group that came out of the thinking and the planning of Cecil Rhodes, did it really intend to rule the world? Well, Quigley wrote that its far-reaching aim was, quote, "nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole." Wow. That's a big mouthful, isn't it? But the group never publicized this ambitious goal. And Quigley learned before he died that his airing of his discovery about it was not looked kindly upon by those who are still working the plan. Quigley should have detected the evil of what he had discovered, but his 3 degrees from Harvard and an entire lifetime spent in academic circles left him ill-equipped to consider the consequences of what he had discovered. He himself had become an elitist, whose arrogant disdain for the ordinary man, especially the ordinary fellow American, led him to champion what other Americans would roundly condemn. Now, the Rhodes Plan sought as a first and very important step the ultimate recovery of the United States of America as an integral part of the British Empire. No thanks is the minimum proper response, right? Especially from an Irishman. Right? Rhodes passed away in 1902 after amassing one of the world's great fortunes with the help of the House of Rothschild. He went to southern Africa, exploited the diamond and gold mines, and became fabulously wealthy. 2 of his 7 wills left a huge amount of money to establish the Rhodes Scholar Program. In another of his books entitled The Anglo-American Establishment, Professor Quigley said that the Rhodes Scholar Program was, quote, "merely a facade to conceal the secret society." Right? Rhodes himself said that. As you are likely aware, the Rhodes Scholar Program takes exceptionally bright Americans and others from English-speaking countries, and they go to England for 2 years to be introduced to the aims of the founder and benefactor of the Rhodes Scholar Program, Cecil Rhodes. Rule the world. Some prominent Rhodes Scholars of today include the #2 man in the State Department, Strobe Talbott, Secretary of Labor Robert Reich, Presidential Advisor George Stephanopoulos, Supreme Court Justice David Souter, and President Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton's resume also includes, besides being a student of Carroll Quigley at Georgetown, he's a Rhodes Scholar. He's a member for many years of the Rhodes-spawned Council on Foreign Relations, member of the Trilateral Commission. He's got all the credentials. And it's really no surprise to find Mr. Clinton speeding this nation as fast as he dares into the world government envisioned by these plotters in the last half of the 19th century. More of the Rhodes money was used to form what these men called the Round Table Groups. And these groups existed in England, in all of the chief British dependencies, and the United States. Then in 1919, these people formed the Royal Institute for International Affairs in England and similar institutes for international affairs in other countries. In the United States, the group that they formed is known as the Council on Foreign Relations. Started in 1921. I happened to be in Australia working for the Birch Society about 10 years ago, and while I was there, I asked some of my Australian hosts, I said, well, where's the conspiracy here in Australia? And they didn't know. They knew something was going on, and I said, let me ask you. I said, is there an Australian Institute for International Affairs? And the fellow says, yes, there is. In fact, he says, it's right here in Melbourne. It's where we were. So I grabbed the phone book, and I looked up, and I said, oh, it's over here on this street. I said, you know where that is? He said, yeah, I know where that is. I said, good, let's go. Ooh, he says, ooh, no. I said, no, come on, let's go. So we walked into the Australian Institute for International Affairs. And I introduced myself as an American who's interested in foreign affairs, and the lady was just so, oh, come right in, and let me show you around. And she showed me a whole bookshelf full of Council on Foreign Relations papers. She showed me another whole bookshelf full of the Trilateral Commission stuff. She was just thrilled and delighted, and she showed me pictures of all the Americans that they had come to speak to their group down there, and I knew all these men. There was Kissinger, there was somebody else. So they networked. There's a South African Institute for International Affairs. There's a New Zealand. There's a Canadian. Now I understand that they're starting one in Argentina. In our nation, this Council on Foreign Relations is the direct descendant of the Rhodes plan to rule the world. That it has always sought world government should come as no surprise. But that it continues to make remarkable progress towards such a goal, which would mean an end to an independent United States of America, is a matter that should concern everyone in this nation. Even if Rush Limbaugh insists that anyone faulting the CFR or even suggesting the existence of a conspiracy is a kook. Right? Now maybe you've heard about the kook test. Right? I want you to know I passed. Right? One of the leading CFR founders was the mysterious Texan Colonel Edward Mandell House. His military title was honorary. A power in the Texas Democrat Party, House had arranged for the election of 4 Texas governors by 1902, but he had larger ambitions than just being the kingmaker of a single state. He began to think of himself as the selector of presidents. He spelled out his ultimate goal in 1912 in a book that he wrote called Philip Drew, Administrator, where he openly called for socialism as dreamed of by Karl Marx. Now, it was House, more than anyone, who helped Woodrow Wilson become president. And Wilson would say of his relationship with House that the two were in total agreement on just about everything. There have been books written about the strange and extremely close relationship of these two men. But what's vitally important for Americans is that several of the fundamental goals of Marx were enacted with Wilson's support. These include the progressive income tax and the Federal Reserve System. House wanted a central government with dictatorial powers. He believed the U.S. Constitution to be a big stumbling block. He started saying it was outdated and that the nation would be better off if it were scrapped. But he also had a plan for a world government. He even called for a League of Nations in his book. House was not unmindful of the clear fact of history that war always means more government, and it can mean world government. So with like-minded individuals from other nations, plans were laid to have the United States go to war. We'll be focusing on the CFR as a citadel of this insider power. But there were advocates of conspiratorial goals, world government, economic control, and so on, before the CFR was ever invented and before it existed. There had to be, or it would never have been created. And as we've seen, all the plotters were not from America. So let's go over some recent history and pull from it some of the varnish, get some of the varnish off and the cover-up that has led so many to the wrong conclusions. And let me assure you that all I intend to do here is place evidence before you. Evidence of a conspiracy. I don't convince you of anything. You're just like I am. You convince yourself. And whatever conclusions you reach in life are always based on evidence. And if the John Birch Society is anything, it's an evidence supplier. We hope very intensely that what we provide or what we steer you to will lead you to the same conclusions we've reached. But you make those yourself. One other point needs to be inserted here. And it is that the strongest instinct in the human being is the need for self-preservation. That's our highest instinct. Now, if you become convinced that the problems facing our nation are the result only of stupidity or bad luck or bumbling, you'll likely not do more than just shrug your shoulders and hope for the best. This is what most Americans do all the time, except for pulling a lever on a voting machine every 2 or 4 years, right? But if you can become convinced, on the other hand, that deliberate planning is at the core of losing personal freedom and national independence, then self-preservation takes over. You become alarmed, you become involved, you want to do something. It's at this point that we would caution anyone to be wary of many tangents that are placed before newly awakened Americans. There are quite a few quick-fix artists. There are legal eager beavers. There are charlatans of various other types and colors out there who are only too glad to harness your energy and relieve you of your dollars while they lead you down a blind alley and into dangerous waters. Now, I also want to stress that what we're doing here tonight is not really an academic exercise. We're talking about a conspiracy of evil. It means to destroy freedom. It means to corrupt your children. It means to abolish your nation. It means to make you a slave and maybe even eliminate you. I want you to pay attention. So now we go to the history we promised. Let's keep in mind the need for a conspiracy to hide what it is doing or to deceive by cloaking its actions with high-sounding purposes and misleading consequences. Ralph Waldo Emerson also once said, every violation of truth is a stab at the health of a human society. We live at a time when our society is being victimized by a multitude of stab wounds. And so let's proceed with some evidence about the existence of a very foul and very powerful conspiracy whose leaders we call the insiders. And we'll start in 1912. We go back to 1912 and we find out that the insiders of that era wanted Wilson as president. There was a president. His name was Taft. And Taft was favored to be re-elected. And so the insiders persuaded an egotistical Teddy Roosevelt to run for a third-party campaign, the Progressive Party, the Bull Moose. And the insiders financed both Wilson and Roosevelt. And all the votes that Roosevelt got were drawn away from Taft, who would have opposed the creation of the Federal Reserve. And so Woodrow Wilson won with 42% of the popular vote. The insiders had actually arranged to choose the president. It would happen many more times. Of remarkable interest is a statement in Wilson's 1913 published book. This is a book that he wrote before he entered the White House that was published after he was in the White House. The book is called The New Freedom. And here's what Woodrow Wilson said. Some of the biggest men in America in the field of commerce and manufacture are afraid of something. They know that there is a power somewhere so organized, so subtle, so watchful, so interlocked, so complete, so pervasive, that they had better not speak above their breath when they speak in condemnation of it. Well, Wilson didn't speak above his breath in condemnation of it. He went and joined them. Now go back and just realize what I said here. A third-party candidate entered the race. The man who won got 42% of the vote, and he became the President of the United States. Didn't that happen just a couple of years ago? Right? Exactly. Bill Clinton, 43% of the vote. Now, who drew the votes away from the other candidate? That was Perot. Am I saying that Perot is part of the conspiracy? No, I'm not. I don't know. I don't know enough about Perot to say one way or another. I know his effect was pronounced, and if it hadn't been for Perot, I don't think Bill Clinton would be in the White House. But the insiders arranged to have Wilson in the White House. Now, even before the 1912 election, a group of 7 powerful and wealthy bankers and government officials met secretly at a place in Georgia called Jekyll Island. This was 1910. They planned the creation of the Federal Reserve. The plotters included Senator Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island, Assistant Secretary of Treasury A. Piatt Andrew, 3 New York bankers representing J.P. Morgan, 1 New York banker representing the Rockefellers, and Paul Warburg, a German banker representing the Rothschilds, working for Kuhn Loeb in New York at the time. Just 7 men. They plotted and schemed, and they gave us the Federal Reserve System, which was finally enacted into law deceitfully in 1913. 25 years later, one of those 7, a man named Frank Vanderlip, wrote an article in the Saturday Evening Post. And he talked about the meeting at Jekyll Island. He said, I was as secretive, indeed as furtive as any conspirator. He used the term. The Federal Reserve, sold as the guardian of the people's interests, was exactly the opposite, and continues to be exactly the opposite. Those people have the power to decide the amount of money, the value of the currency, the rate of interest. They have an economic stranglehold on America. They can create a boom, they can create a bust, and they can do so just prior to an election in order to hurt or help a candidate that they favor. And they've done it, and we wrote about it in the book Financial Terrorism. Now, I mentioned the use of war to bring about more government, even world government. No ordinary American wanted to be in World War I. It's not our fight, people said. It's the Germans fighting against the others. Let them go. Let them have at it. Right? The war started in 1914. We actually didn't get involved for 3 years. But what got us involved? Well, one of the main things that got us involved in it was the sinking of the passenger liner Lusitania, which was not a passenger liner. It was an armed auxiliary cruiser of the British Navy. Now, the British do the same kind of thing that we do here in America. We have a big event that happened, and they take all the evidence about it, and they put it in a time capsule, and they bury it for 50 years or for 75 years. So 50 years after all of the investigations into the sinking of the Lusitania, they opened up these things, and a British journalist named Colin Simpson wrote a book called The Lusitania, the startling truth about one of the most fateful of all disasters of the sea. Well, what did they say in the book? What did this British journalist say? He said that the Lusitania was carrying 6 million rounds of ammunition, plus other munitions. He said that the British had cracked the German code and knew exactly where all the German submarines were. He said that the Lusitania was sent into the submarine area at a reduced speed. Before the incident, Winston Churchill, then the head of the British Admiralty, had ordered a report done to predict the political impact if a passenger ship were sunk carrying Americans. And the following conversation took place between Colonel House and Sir Edward Grey, the British foreign minister. Sir Edward Grey said to House, "What will America do if the Germans sink an ocean liner with American passengers on board?" And House replied, "I believe that a flame of indignation would sweep the United States, and that by itself would be sufficient to carry us into the war." So the ship was hit with a torpedo right in the area of the munitions, and the explosion aboard the ship was much greater than the torpedo itself. And the ship went to the bottom very quickly. 1,200 victims, 128 of them Americans. And it enraged the people in the United States, and it became the excuse for us to get involved in a war that we never should have been involved in. The British put together a investigation into the whole thing, and it was headed by a decent human being named Lord Mersey, M-E-R-S-E-Y. And Mersey was quoted even back then that it was a damn dirty business. And indeed it was. But it was done by the insiders of the day in order to get the United States involved in war. Now, if we go back and remember that this Colonel House wrote a book in 1912, and he called for the income tax, and he called for the Federal Reserve System, he also called for, by name, a League of Nations. One of the goals of getting us into the war is to get us into this world government. So President Wilson, who was like Pinocchio on the strings, with House holding the strings, proposed exactly a League of Nations in 1918. And then House and his young associates put together the Charter for the League of Nations, went off to Europe working on the Versailles Treaty, and they got word that the United States had said no. The Senate had turned thumbs down on our entry into the League of Nations. We should be very grateful for that. The young associates of Edward Mandell House during this period were John Foster Dulles, Allen Dulles, Christian Herter, Walter Lippmann, Sumner Welles, all of whom became very, very influential Americans, all of them except Lippmann in government itself, head of the CIA, State Department, Secretary of State, and so on. Well, when they got the word that the United States was not going to get involved in the League of Nations, then they got together and it was time for the Council on Foreign Relations. We've got to have an organization to persuade the American people to want world government, and so they formed it. The British formed the Royal Institute, as I said, and the CFR was formed here. The very second edition of the magazine that's put out by the Council on Foreign Relations, a magazine called Foreign Affairs, said the real problem today is that of world government. And what they meant was the real problem in the world is that we don't have a world government. So they began to spread their desire for world government. They even began to plan World War II. Now in 1917, Russia, of course, fell to the Bolsheviks. And we see the arch conspirator of the 20th century again, this Edward Mandell House. When the Tsar was overthrown, the Bolsheviks didn't take over immediately. The immediate takeover was by the socialists under Kerensky. Well, at that point, Lenin and Trotsky, who had both been thrown out of Russia, started back. Lenin was in Switzerland, and he went back through Germany in a sealed railroad car. Trotsky was in New York City. And he proved something that I suppose many of you know, that you can recruit for anything in New York City. He'd recruited a few Bolsheviks. So he took them back with him and on a ship, and he was given $20 million by an American banker named Warburg. Well, no, it was Jacob Schiff, relative of the Warburg. He and his coterie of Bolsheviks on a ship heading back for Russia. The ship stopped in Canada. One of the pivotal events of the 20th century took place. Canadian authorities came aboard the ship and arrested Trotsky. Why? Very simple. Trotsky had maintained that he intended to go back to Russia, take Russia out of World War I, which was then raging. The Canadians theorized if he's successful in doing what he said he wants to do, that will mean that the German troops that are fighting on the Russian front can leave there and go and fight on the other front and kill Canadians who were fighting alongside the British, the French, and the Americans. So the Canadians said, no, we don't want that to happen, and they held Trotsky. They actually arrested him until pressure was put on him to put him back on the ship. And the pressure came from the White House in Washington, D.C., the work of Edward Mandell House. He got the president to put pressure on the British through a British emissary, and then the British put pressure on the Canadians. They put Trotsky back on the ship. Trotsky and Lenin did get together in Russia, and you know what happened to Russia for all those years. And the United States began to help the Bolsheviks right from the beginning. Well, we move on now. We go up to 1929, and you've all heard that there was a stock market crash, and we entered the Great Depression in 1929. And it was really a proof that the free enterprise system doesn't work, or so they would say. Well, I'm not old enough to remember the Roaring '20s, but I've read about it. In the Roaring '20s, where everybody was getting rich, and all you had to do was get yourself into the stock market, and you could borrow money, and you could buy stocks, and pretty soon you could be able to sell them at a great profit, and then you could buy some more and get in deeper, and everybody was just making all kinds of money until all of a sudden somebody pulled the string, and they started calling in the loans. Broker call loans, they called them. You had to get the money up within 24 hours. In order to be able to do that, you had to sell whatever stock you had, and a lot of people all of a sudden started selling stock, and what happens to the stock market? Goes right down the chute, doesn't it? They pulled the plug, right? Now, there were a couple of people beforehand who knew that that was going to happen, and so what they had done was they had sold all their stock before the plug got pulled when the price was very high, and they made quite a bit of money. And then with the money that they had, the cash, the liquidity, as soon as the stocks went down to almost nothing, they bought back 1 cent on the dollar. That would have included the Rockefellers, a fellow named Barney Baruch, and a fellow named Joseph P. Kennedy over in Massachusetts. They got out early. They bought back in when the stocks hit bottom. So you see that the stock market crash of 1929 didn't discredit the free enterprise system. What it did was show that if it had really been a free enterprise system, that never would have happened. But the invitation was there for massive government, wasn't it? It got FDR elected in 1932. Now, the Democrats nominated Roosevelt in 1932 on a platform that was quite compatible with my own attitude about what ought to be done today. The Democrats in 1932 said in their platform that they wanted to remove the government from fields of private enterprise. Right? And there was a lot more conservative type rhetoric in this. And FDR just said, that's me, I'm all for that, I'm all for that. Right? Well, the convention ended in Chicago, and Roosevelt started back for New York. But he went right past New York. And he went up to Massachusetts, a little town on the northeast coast up there named Magnolia. And he went to visit an old man, Edward Mandell House. Well, Herbert Hoover was president, and he tried to get reelected, and I got problems with Herbert Hoover, but not near as many as I have with Roosevelt. Herbert Hoover wanted to get the government out of this, and wanted to get the government out of that. He refused the National Recovery Act that Roosevelt slammed through, and it was finally declared unconstitutional. The National Recovery Act is out-and-out fascism. Now, what's fascism? It's economic control without government ownership. The government controls, but it doesn't own outright. That's fascism. It's a form of socialism. But the government doesn't own. And that is what is infecting America today. Well, we entered into a prolonged depression, didn't we? Right? If the government hadn't been in there trying to fix the problem, as they said, the recession would have ended long before. And then Roosevelt started bringing Council on Foreign Relations members into government. Stettinius, Stimson, Wells. There was one point towards the end of the 30s when a congressman named Martin Dies from Texas who started, he was the chairman of a congressional committee that became known as the House Committee on Un-American Activities. He went to the president. He was a Democrat. He went to his leader, President Roosevelt, with the names of thousands of disloyal communists who were working for the federal government. And Roosevelt's response was to throw him out of his office. And he said, some of the best friends I've got are communists. And indeed they were. In 1939, the Council on Foreign Relations offered to set up a special committee within the State Department called the War and Peace Studies Group. Pretty soon, they took over the State Department as they were preparing for the next war. They've had control of it ever since. Now, I want to tell you a little-known story. There will be some veteran members of the Burt Society that have probably heard this. But during this period, prior to our entry into World War II, there was an American citizen who was the code clerk at the United States Embassy in London. His name was Tyler Kent. Now, a code clerk at an embassy is not a subordinate position. It's the number 3 position in a embassy. And so he was a trained diplomat. And his father had been a diplomat. His father was now deceased. He grew up in diplomatic circles. He knew the diplomatic rules and procedures, and he was a loyal American. In November 1938, there was a book published in England called Propaganda in the Next War. Now, you got to realize that England is already duking it out with Germany. On page 148 of this book, it says, it will need a definite threat to America, a threat, moreover, which will have to be brought home by propaganda to every citizen before the Republic will again take arms in an external quarrel. Here they are wanting us to get in war again. The position will naturally be considerably eased if Japan were involved, and this might and probably would bring America in without further ado. This was 1938. If Japan would. Well, we move up a year now, we're into 1939, and what do we see? We see Tyler Kent, the code clerk in our embassy, is asked to transmit a message from a British citizen to the President of the United States. All right, there's quite a few things wrong with this. First of all, a head of state will communicate with a head of state, nobody else. All right? Well, this man was in government, and his name was Winston Churchill. Once again, Winston Churchill is giving Kent a message to transmit to the president, and he already has it in the unbreakable code, which obviously had been broken or given to the British. All right, now what's the message? Here's the message. I am half American and the natural person to work with you. It is evident we see eye to eye. Were I to become Prime Minister of Britain, we could control the world. That's the message. Tyler Kent sent the message and kept a copy of it. And he was asked to send quite a few more messages, and he kept the copies of them. And pretty soon, in May of 1940, he was arrested by British authorities. He had his diplomatic immunity waived for him by his ambassador, Joseph P. Kennedy. Now, Kennedy had been stating very clearly that he favored non-intervention as far as the United States in this war. He was part of the America First movement at the time. He didn't want us to get involved in World War II. 90% of the American people felt that way, and that was pollsters that were taking that. Well, Kennedy came back to the U.S., and he was expected to make a radio speech nationwide. President Roosevelt heard about it, called him down to Washington, gave him a talk. So he went and made the radio speech, and it was pro-British. It was pro-involvement in the war. In other words, somebody was yanking his string. Now, Tyler Kent was obliged to handle the messages. He was obliged to participate in a crime, and so he made copies to protect himself, and then hopefully later on to expose the plotters. His mother, the widow of a diplomat, knew all kinds of diplomatic procedures. She fought like a Turk all during World War II, excuse me, but he stayed in jail. They jailed him to keep him silenced. They jailed him to keep him from imparting to the members of Congress and to the American people information which we all had a right to know. They finally allowed him to come home in December of 1945. When he arrived home, he told a reporter that he could solve the riddle about the origins of the war as far as America was concerned. He wrote to the Senate, and he said he had a moral right to copy those messages. He offered to tell his story, but he got nowhere. He got nowhere. There is a little book that used to be available. I don't think it's available anymore, but it's full of other kinds of information. The Case of Tyler Kent. We're talking about insiders behind the scenes, pulling the strings. We got involved in World War II. How did we get involved? Just as they had predicted in that book. The Japanese fired the first shot, didn't they? They fired the shot at Pearl Harbor. And our government, our president, and George Marshall had broken the Japanese code. They knew that the planes were coming, and they didn't even warn our people in Hawaii. The Admiral Kimmel and the General Short both demanded to be court-martialed so that they could tell their story. And the family of Admiral Kimmel is still fighting for justice for that deceased patriot. I know his grandson down in South Carolina. Well, Pearl Harbor happened. We lost lots of men, lots of planes, lots of ships. Congress met, declared war on Japan. Perfectly proper. The very next day, Germany declared war on us. We were now all of a sudden involved in two wars. They called it World War II, but it was actually two wars. And everything we had in a military sense went to Europe. And the Pacific forces were starved. The reason was to help defeat Hitler so that he wouldn't defeat the USSR. At the end of the war, we allowed the Soviets to take Eastern Europe. The Pacific War should have ended in January of 1945. January. It didn't end until August. It didn't end until after the atomic bomb was dropped. But in January of 1945, General MacArthur sent the Japanese detailed surrender proposal. All of the conditions that they finally accepted and allowed them to surrender in August. Which means that Iwo Jima never had to be. Okinawa never had to be. And the bomb dropped on the innocent Japanese civilians never had to be. Harry Truman became president. As with FDR, Truman brought in Council on Foreign Relations people to vital posts. Secretary of State Dean Acheson, Undersecretary of State Robert Lovett, Averell Harriman, Ambassador to Russia. John McCloy was there, George Kennan, Charles Boland. Our government had already established a great pattern of helping the Soviet Union, every possible way you could imagine. In the 20s with food to rescue the Lenin and Trotsky government, in the 30s with diplomatic recognition and economic help, in the 40s with Lend-Lease and built them into a world power, in the 50s with more kinds of help, in the 60s with airborne communications parts and radar and tire cord factories and chemical plants and machine tools and computers and everything possible to build a nuclear arsenal to aim at us. And all during this period, the American people were perfectly willing to have government grow so that we might be able to oppose a potential Soviet threat. In 1962, a government publication excuse me, was written under order by the State Department. A man named Lincoln P. Bloomfield, a professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Massachusetts. A world effectively controlled by the United Nations. It was originally classified, became unclassified, and we got a copy of it. Now, there's an awful lot in here. And this is a program that would disarm all nations. It would supply the United Nations with taxing authority. It called for a United Nations force of 500,000 men. It called for the United Nations to have nuclear weapons. Compulsory jurisdiction of the World Court. On and on and on. A world effectively controlled by the United Nations. And it's very blunt language. There's no circumspection here because this was a classified document. It was only supposed to go to people on the know. But it did go to more than just those people eventually. Now, all during this period, as I said, we were helping the Soviet Union. And why? Well, Bloomfield tells us. Bloomfield, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He says right here, if the communist dynamic were greatly abated, the West might well lose whatever incentive it has for world government. Right? Build up the Soviet Union, make them frightful, scare the American people into world government. Because if the communist dynamic were greatly abated, the West might well lose whatever incentive it has for world government. Incredible. And that was going on. And ladies and gentlemen, it's still going on. Please don't feel that communism is dead. Right? Even if it's not dead in Russia, it could come back tomorrow as more fearsome than anywhere from China. Right? Well, they then formed NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. 1949, we got involved in NATO because NATO was going to keep us from being overrun by the Soviets. I just short-circuited everybody here, didn't I? I think we're there. I can't blame the insiders for that, I don't think. Just last November, President Clinton announced that he was sending 20,000 United States military personnel to Bosnia. And he said American troops will take their orders from the American general who commands NATO. And you don't have to worry about these troops being placed in a foreign command. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that's a bald-faced lie. Right? Yes, there is an American general. His name is Joulwan, Joulwan, General Joulwan. But before the troops went over to Bosnia, General Joulwan went to Brussels to NATO headquarters, where he got his orders from the NATO Supreme Command to send the troops. He didn't get them from Washington, D.C., he got them from Brussels. There's 16 member nations in NATO, we're one. We have one vote of those 16, but we went along with it. And now NATO has always been considered by the American people as a good thing. After all, it was a force, a defensive force against the possibility of the Soviets invading Western Europe and maybe even coming here. Well, that's the way it was sold to us. But in 1949, the CFR Secretary of State named Dean Acheson, he gave a speech and he said the United States government and the governments with which we are associated in this treaty are convinced that it is an essential measure for strengthening the United Nations. You see, in 1945, the United States Congress passed the United Nations Participation Act, and that gave the president authority to send troops into a United Nations operation with a limit of 1,000. And so we have sent troops, and there have been blue-helmeted troops here and there. There are 550 of them in Macedonia. There was going to be 551 until Michael New said he wouldn't go. So they're wearing the blue helmets. But the troops that are in Bosnia are not wearing the blue helmets. Are they part of a United Nations operation? Well, ladies and gentlemen, I have a NATO handbook here, and this has the North Atlantic Treaty in it, 1949. There are 13 articles, 14 articles, and a preamble. The United Nations is mentioned 7 different times. Right? And then we go to the UN Charter, and we see Articles 52, 3, and 4, and it talks about regional arrangements. And it didn't mention NATO, but it mentions what NATO is, and it says it's perfectly proper for nations to form these collective security agencies as long as they continue to report everything they do to the United Nations. Is NATO part of the United Nations? Absolutely. Absolutely. We now have military strategists in the United States saying that it's time to convert the NATO military force, which is mostly Americans, into a permanent United Nations army. That's what they're headed for. Truman left office in 1952. We now, in 1952, have the first time where we have a Democrat and a Republican running for President of the United States, both of whom are members of the Council on Foreign Relations. We have Dwight Eisenhower and Adlai Stevenson. What about this Eisenhower? He announced that he voted for FDR in 1944. In 1948, he let it be known that he was perfectly willing to be nominated for the Democrat Party for president. He was still willing to be a Democrat nominee in 1951. 2 years before that, he had accepted membership in the Council on Foreign Relations. There was a group formed called Republican Advance. Who helped to form it? Allen Dulles, John Foster Dulles, Christian Herders, founders of the Council on Foreign Relations, and Richard Nixon. This progressive Republican group accepted funding from the Americans for Democratic Action. That's a British Fabian socialist organization supposed to be Democrats. And Francis Biddle, the delighted Democrat, stated his wish that these two groups, Republican Advance and the Americans for Democratic Action, become formally affiliated since they're both working for the same goals. Obviously, they were working for the same goals. But this Republican Advance group led to the formation of Citizens for Eisenhower early in 1952. Eisenhower announced that he was now a Republican, and his campaign manager, Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts, said that he was a lifelong Republican. Well, Robert Taft was supposed to be the nominee. Robert Taft, senator from Ohio, Mr. Republican, they called him. Had he been elected, he would have unraveled decades of insider progress, and so the nomination was stolen. And I mean stolen. One of the chief architects of stealing the nomination was a man named Earl Warren in California. And Earl Warren was then named to be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, and he had no legal training. None. But he certainly had training amongst the insiders. They stole the nomination from Taft, and then Eisenhower picked Richard Nixon to be his running mate. Robert Taft said, Richard Nixon, he's a little man in a big hurry. Yes, indeed. What did the Eisenhower administration accomplish? They stopped the Reece Committee investigating tax-exempt foundations. They stopped Joseph McCarthy investigating the communist penetration of the U.S. government. McCarthy's attitude was very simple. He said, I'm not questioning whether a man can be a communist or not. I'm questioning whether or not a communist should be employed in a sensitive position in the United States government. Okay? And even just the last week or so, we see more revelations coming out proving that McCarthy was right. McCarthy was on target, right? Eisenhower started summit meetings with the Soviets, sitting down with brutal murderers. Eisenhower abandoned the Hungarian revolt after his administration had persuaded them to revolt in 1956. Eisenhower's administration was responsible for placing Castro in Cuba. And that was a CIA operation. Who was the head of the CIA? Allen Dulles, one of the founders of the CFR. Who was the Secretary of State? his brother, John Foster, another founder of the Council on Foreign Relations. Dulles died in 1959, and he was replaced as Secretary of State by Christian Herter, who was also in on the founding of the Council on Foreign Relations. So we move on, and we see, now we get 1960. John F. Kennedy versus Richard Nixon. Very interesting thing happened a couple of years prior to 1960. Some of you may recall that John Kennedy tried to be the vice presidential nominee of the Democrat Party in 1956. And he didn't succeed. And after he didn't succeed, he and his brothers and his friends decided next time we're going for the whole ball of wax, not just vice president, we're going all the way. And so they began to lay their plans. Now, about midway between 56 and 60, there was a great big Democrat gathering, and of course Kennedy was there, and one of the people running this particular operation was Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt, who had personally joined over 100 cited Communist Front organizations. So Eleanor Roosevelt at the microphone, she's about to introduce John Kennedy, and she says to him, she says, Jack, there's something I always wanted to ask you. She said, I know that when the vote on McCarthy came up in the Senate, that you were in the hospital, you had back trouble. And I've always wanted to ask you, Jack, if you had been in the Senate at the time, you would have voted against McCarthy, wouldn't you? And he said, of course. And in my view, at that point, he was permitted to be the President of the United States. His cabinet was Rusk and McNamara and Gardner and Califano and Fowler, all Council on Foreign Relations members. He started the disarmament program that we are now suffering under and turning over our military to the United Nations. The CIA arranged the Bay of Pigs operation, abandoning the people that they sent ashore and strengthening Castro's hands. In 1960, Nixon took the Republican platform from California, conservative Republican platform, flew across the country between the platform week and the full convention week, spent the weekend in Nelson Rockefeller's home in New York City, rewrote the platform, went back and gave it back to them and said, here's the platform. Right? And they tried to tell me later on that he's a conservative. In 1967, after losing, he wrote an article for Foreign Affairs magazine called Asia After Vietnam, predicting that the United States would, in fact, recognize Red China. And what happened? He started the progress. He started the whole process. He was carrying out his own foretelling. Well, after John Kennedy was killed, we had Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson ran for the Senate and the vice presidency in 1960 on contradictory platforms. Right? This is a man of honor. Right? Got us in the Vietnam War, got us in deeper and deeper into the Vietnam War, which meant more government, moral decline. It was fought under SEATO, S-E-A-T-O, exactly the same as NATO. Having been used, it's now gone. The Great Society, the other half of the New World Order. The New World Order is socialism and world government. The Great Society is the socialism part. World government's the United Nations. Then we get Richard Nixon come back in 1968. He becomes the president. He brings into government Henry Kissinger. The man who introduced him to Kissinger was William F. Buckley, who's now a member of the CFR himself. Richard Nixon ended up dignifying Red China, wage and price controls, created the Environmental Protection Agency with an executive order. Congress didn't create it, he did. Canceled USSR's Lend-Lease debt. Huge select escalation of aid and trade to the communists. Disgraceful close to the Vietnam War, leaving our POWs. Out via Watergate, in comes Ford. There were 195 members of the Council on Foreign Relations in the Nixon administration. Gerald Ford comes into power. 199 members of the Council on Foreign Relations. Not only retained Kissinger, but practically bowed before him, let him do whatever he wanted. Then we get up to Jimmy Carter. Now we're into the book. That's when I started writing The Insiders. Carter brings into government Brzezinski, Vance, Mondale, Brown, Blumenthal, all of them CFR members, also now Trilateral Commission members. It had been formed in 1973 by Brzezinski and David Rockefeller. Now we're up to 279 members of the Council on Foreign Relations as U.S. government officials. We get Carter out, we get Reagan in, we get good rhetoric. but the performance was very much the same. A very interesting thing happened in 1980. Here's Ronald Reagan running for president, the New Hampshire primaries, first primary in the nation. The very day of the primary, before the votes were even counted, Reagan fired his longtime aide, John Sears, who was his campaign manager, and he brought in a Council on Foreign Relations lawyer from New York City named William Casey. John Sears out, William Casey in, Ronald Reagan just takes off. Then he brings into government Alexander Haig, George Shultz, Donald Regan, Malcolm Baldrige, Caspar Weinberger, and so on. All Council on Foreign Relations, same all over again. We're up to 257 members of the Council on Foreign Relations now. Ronald Reagan had promised to abolish the Department of Energy. The Department of Education never even lifted a finger to try. Astronomical debt. 8 years of that, we get George Bush, who used to be on the board of directors of the Council on Foreign Relations, one of the earliest members of the Trilateral Commission. He brings into government Cheney, Scowcroft, Brady, Powell, all kinds of people. Yeah, he brought Powell into government. Right. Now we're up to 382 members of the Council on Foreign Relations as U.S. government officials. George Bush out, Bill Clinton in. Bill Clinton, Rhodes Scholar, Council on Foreign Relations, Trilateral Commission. Very interesting thing happened early in the campaign, 1992. There were a whole bunch of Democrats trying to get the nomination. You may recall Senator Kerry from Nebraska, Harkin from Iowa, Tsongas from Massachusetts, former senator, Governor Wilder down in Virginia, Jesse Jackson, even Pat Brown's son, Jerry Brown from California. So they have a big debate. And Bill Clinton, of course, is there. Now, here's Bill Clinton. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission. Here's George Bush is going to be the Republican nominee. He's already president. There's no doubt about it. He's going to run again. And he's a former member of the board of directors of the Council on Foreign Relations and a very early member of the Trilateral Commission. So all of those others except Clinton, this fella Kerry and Harkin and Jackson and Tsongas and Wilder and Brown, they all could have said, ladies and gentlemen of the great TV audience watching our Democrat debate here, why would you choose Clinton? Because if you choose Clinton, you're going to get a duplicate of George Bush. Right? That would have been very easy for any of them to say that. How many did? Right? Jerry Brown hinted at it once and then got told, you better not. And that was that. So all of a sudden now we get a repeat of 1912. We get Clinton with 43% of the vote. He becomes the President of the United States. And there are now over 400 members of the Council on Foreign Relations in high positions in government in Washington, D.C. Clinton's the man who went on MTV, the rock television station that does so much harm, and he told all the teenagers listening that the Constitution of the United States was a radical document. The Bill of Rights of the United States Constitution was a radical document. And then he swore an oath to support and defend it. No thanks. There's secrecy in government. We had Presidential Decision Directive 25, under which our troops are in Bosnia, but we don't know because they classified it secret and haven't even let Congress see it. The Constitution of the United States is pretty plain. The Constitution of the United States says Congress shall have power to provide rules and regulations for the government of the land and naval forces. Not the President, the Congress. NAFTA, GATT, Haiti, Bosnia, on and on we go, deeper and deeper into world government. NAFTA and GATT are economic unions. All you have to know about them is that an economic union always precedes a political union, which always precedes world government. That's what it's all about. It's a lot easier to get a grouping of nations into your final goal than it is 185 individual sovereign nations. And that's what it's all about. So now we're up to a choice of 1996, when it looks like it's going to be Bob Dole versus Bill Clinton, and who knows what else. There are people who ask me all the time, do you think we need a third party? And I said, no, we need a second party. Right? Dole voted for tax increases. Tax increases in 1982, tax increases 1984. He's the man who ushered through George Bush's no new taxes pledge. Right? In 1990, they gave us more taxes. He shepherded NAFTA through the Senate. He shepherded GATT through the Senate. He's in favor of gun control. He caves in. If you wanted to know anything about Robert Dole, all you have to know is that his nickname amongst a lot of us is Senator Compromise. And you can know a lot more, too, from the vicious attack that was waged against Pat Buchanan. Now, there are today 3,300 some odd members of the Council on Foreign Relations. Now, am I saying that every one of them is a conspirator? And the answer is no. In fact, I'm saying that 10% of them probably are conspirators, and the rest are going along to get along. They will do what the Council on Foreign Relations want. They will mouth the programs. They will get others to see it and to understand it and carry it along. And yet, if you wrote to the Council on Foreign Relations down in New York City and asked them why do they take a position like this, they will write back to you and say, we never take a position on anything. We're a talking shop. All we do is debate matters. We welcome points of view from all different competing sides. Right? And that's a bald-faced lie. They don't welcome mine. So how is it that they work? What is it? How do they do it? Do they write to each of them and say, okay, here's what you do now? Right? Here's what you do now? No, that's not the way it works at all. They publish. They have the Foreign Affairs magazine. They have columnists that are part of their operation. They put out the word. They have a lot of different ways of letting people know the proper attitude, the politically correct attitude to take, I guess you could say. So now the head of the CFR today is Peter G. Peterson. He's a former commerce head of the Nixon administration. He's an investment banker in New York. And he's now the chairman, succeeded David Rockefeller. He writes a letter from the chairman in the annual report of the magazine, the annual report that comes out once a year. The last one in 1995 came out, and he said, it shall be the purpose of the Council on Foreign Relations to shape the debate on matters of importance to the United States of America. Now, wait a minute. You say you don't take a position, then how can you shape the debate? Right? So he's admitting there that this business of never taking a position is a lie. But what he has told us is exactly what they do. They shape the debate. And you can debate the matter between the areas that they have shaped. If you step outside that, you're a wacko, kook, conspirator yourself, or a bircher maybe. Right? Now let me give you an example of how it works. And this is something that they carried just recently in their magazine. Should Poland and Hungary and some other Eastern European nations be given seats in NATO? Right? And right within the Council on Foreign Relations magazine, you had some people saying, yes, it's a good idea. Others saying, no, it will offend the Russians, don't do it. And you could take either side of that and stay within the parameters that they've established. But are those the only alternatives? I got another alternative. Give Poland our seat. And we're out of there. That's how they operate. A couple of years ago, should we take some foreign aid away from Egypt and Israel and give it to Poland and Hungary and the Czech Republic? Right? And you could take either side of that. That's within the parameters. I got another alternative. No foreign aid to anybody. It's all totally unconstitutional. Right? But if you take that position, you're outside the debate that has been shaped by the Council on Foreign Relations, and that's how it operates. And they do the same thing when you go and you pull a lever for President of the United States, don't they? Right? Which why it makes it so hard to have an additional, I'm not going to say a third, I'm going to say an additional political party. I started the beginning of this survey of recent history. My purpose was to introduce you to a conspiracy that threatens everything we hold dear. If the insiders have their way, they will take control of this nation, even the world. They will destroy freedom. They will make slaves of all of us. They will rule with brutality, with treachery. They will tolerate no opposition if they get total power. And I can't stress this enough. This is not an academic exercise, not a mere difference of opinion. Good leaders would never deal in secrecy and falsehood. If I've demonstrated anything, I hope that I've demonstrated that we've been victims of lying and secret plotting. It's only been done for one purpose: keep the victims asleep, to fasten the threads of tyranny around the people without the people being aware until it's too late for them to do anything about it. ladies and gentlemen, it's not too late. The lies can be countered, the conspirators can be exposed, freedom can be preserved. What's needed is a plan to take our country back from the insiders. And that's what the John Birch Society is all about. The Constitution of the United States says all bills for raising revenue shall originate in the House of Representatives. That's why we have the TRIM program, to report to the people on how their representative does regarding the Constitution. Does he stick by his oath, or does he put it in the bottom drawer and go do whatever they tell him to do? No one wants to be a slave, and government has the capability of making slaves of all of us, so it's time to put the government under that Constitution. It's time to rein in that power, to take it back. If the Constitution of the United States were fully enforced, the federal government would be 20% its size and 20% its cost. We wouldn't be involved in all over the world. We'd bring the troops home. We'd stop this foreign aid draining of America. So Congress is the key. Congress can even defund the left, much of which comes from government. But it's absolutely true that a well-informed people cannot be led into slavery. Isaiah the prophet said, "My people have been led into captivity because they had no knowledge." Had they had good information, they would have been able to stay free, and the situation prevails today, the same thing. TRIM bulletins and all the educational materials distributed by the John Birch Society can help to keep us free. A well-informed people cannot be led into slavery. That's our program. And it focuses on the House of Representatives, which is why our TRIM program reports on the representatives. We don't have a TRIM program for the Senate. It's not needed. What's needed is a majority of the House of Representatives to refuse appropriations for this and this and this and this unless the power is herein granted in the Constitution of the United States. Well, can it be done? It's up to you. It's up to me, yes, but it's up to you just as much as it is to me, every one of you. We cited some lines from a verse written by James Russell Lowell. He said, "Truth, forever on the scaffold, wrong, forever on the throne." But he didn't end with that rather discouraging assessment. So let's go back to James Russell Lowell and read a couple more lines. Right? Truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne, yet the scaffold sways the future, and beyond the dim unknown standeth God within the shadow, keeping watch above his own. God does watch over us, and he will help us if we first do whatever we can, up to the point we can do no more, and then we can ask and expect that God will help us. We want you to do what you can while you're praying, and we ask you to do it through the John Birch Society. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, as promised, there's not going to be anything more. I'm to close the program. Do you have an announcement? You don't have it? Okay, well, one quick announcement, and I'll stay up here, and anybody that has a book and wants me to, if you have any questions, come on up, and I'll be happy to talk to anybody. All right, it's yours.